In this video, I have a conversation with Matthew Adelstein. Matthew has a YouTube channel called Deliberation Under Ideal Conditions and two blogs that I'll link down below. It's also worth pointing out that I forgot to press record on my camera for the first minute or so just gonna have to stick a picture of my face in there for the meantime. You'll just have to use your imagination. With all that out of the way, let's listen to a conversation with Matthew Adelstein.
So I think moral realism is the idea that there's some moral statements that are true in a way that doesn't depend on people's attitudes. So, this means that basically, if you think that some things about morality are truly objective, and they're objective independent of anyone. Sorry, the lights just automatically turn off in this room.
You just didn't feel like the need to dance suddenly.
Yeah. So I think that, if you think that there are moral statements that are true independently of people's attitudes towards them, then you're a moral realist. So there are different ways you can deny this. So one way you deny this is you can be a non-cognitivist, where what you say is that moral sentences, they're actually neither true nor false. So to say X is wrong is sort of like saying, don't do X. So if you say murder is wrong, you're saying don't murder. And if you say don't murder, that's a command. Commands clearly don't have truth values. So that's one way of denying it. One way of denying it is to just say all moral sentences are false. That's called error theory. So if a person says it's wrong to torture infants, that's false. And then one way of denying it is to be a subjectivist. So you think that there are some true moral statements, but they depend on people's attitudes towards them in some way.
Yeah, so I think a lot of people that come into this conversation without much prior knowledge just assume that morality is subjective. I think a lot of people take that for granted. I did, certainly. Relativism isn't a particularly popular position amongst academics, I don't believe. So why exactly would one reject cultural relativism or subjectivism?
So I think that the basic reason to reject cultural relativism or subjectivism is that they say things that are wildly implausible. So just to clarify our terms, so cultural relativism says that when you say something is wrong, what you're really saying is that thing is disapproved of by the norms of your culture, or maybe of whatever culture you're in, something like that. And subjectivism says that when you say something is wrong, you're expressing basically that you disapprove of that thing, or that maybe if you knew all the relevant empirical facts or something, then you would disapprove of it. Okay, so then the question is, why disbelieve this? Well, it has to say things that are very implausible. So if you're an individual subjectivist, then suppose that a person who just, their sole aspiration in life is to torture as many people as possible. This person says, brutally torturing people is great, and promoting flourishing is terrible. When he says that, that would be true, because that's true according to his current attitudes.
Mm-hmm.
And yet that doesn't seem so plausible. And if you're a cultural relativist, then as long as something is approved of by a culture, you can't really condemn it. So if a culture is fine with massacring people, if a culture is fine with just the most horrifying things imaginable, in Nazi Germany, their culture approved of killing Jewish people. You would have to say that in their culture, when they when people in their culture said it's great to kill Jewish people, they were actually saying true things, and that doesn't seem plausible at all.
Yeah, would you say that it's fair to say that if cultural relativism was true, there would be no moral reason to adjust society's values? So we abolished slavery, for example. If the culture approved of slavery, why would we change our minds on that?
Yeah, I think that that's true. Now, I mean, maybe the cultural relativists could say, well, maybe there are deeper values in the culture that disapprove of slavery. So maybe at a superficial level, they approve of slavery, but there's some sort of deeper and more important sense in which they disapprove of slavery, given that they espouse norms about equal rights. But I agree that you can't really argue that as long as the culture's norms are consistent with one another, you can't argue for shifting them if you're a cultural relativist.
Yeah, this is a bit similar to an argument that Russ Schaefer Landau made. I was reading The Fundamentals of Ethics recently, and he sort of makes an argument from self-assessment. So we, after we do something, we'll ask ourselves whether or not it was the right thing to do. So, for example, I stopped exploiting animals, and that was a product of me reflecting on me exploiting animals and then thinking, is it right to exploit animals? But if subjectivism is true, it's right to exploit animals as long as I think it is. So it almost wouldn't make sense to reflect on our past actions.
Yeah, I agree with that. And and it just seems like subjectivism incorrectly captures what you are wondering about in that moment. So when you're, like deciding whether or not to stop eating animals, and you think, okay, maybe is this wrong? Here are two things you're definitely not asking. One, do I currently disapprove of that thing? Obviously you don't. And two, does my culture disapprove of that thing? Obviously it does not. Your culture is perfectly fine with that. Seems like you're asking some further question, which is, is it wrong? So I think this shows that the picture sketched out by relativism is incorrect.
Yeah, I had a friend talk to me recently who was making the case for subjectivism, and he was sort of making the case that it more readily aligns with our experience. He says, like, I know that I believe that murder is wrong, but to add an extra layer to that it's wrong objectively, is sort of to take an extra step. And yeah, I mean, the way I feel it is that actually subjectivism doesn't really seem to align with our experience. But when I assess my moral choices, I'm not asking, is it appropriate according to the culture, or is it permissible? Like, do I think it's permissible? It seems like I'm referencing something outside myself, referencing some kind of standard. Am I in line with the moral facts, rather than do I happen to believe something is moral? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think that suppose that we're thinking about whether something is bad rather than immoral. So suppose that I don't know, like drop something on your foot and you're in pain. When you think like, this is bad, what you're thinking is not like, my culture disapproves of this. Maybe your culture does disapprove of it, but that's not what you're thinking. It seems like when something is bad, at least when it's bad for you, you'll generally disapprove of it. But that doesn't seem to be really what you're saying either, because there can be cases where you disapprove of something, but you recognize that you really don't have a good reason to disapprove of it. So you might irrationally disapprove of something. You might, for example, you might disapprove of I don't know, having to go to work or something, even if you think it's ultimately a good thing. Or you might disapprove of, if when one's a young child, they may disapprove of sandwiches that are cut into squares rather than triangles. But when we ask whether it's bad, we're not just asking whether we currently disapprove of it. We're asking something more like whether it's worth disapproving of. And subjectivism just can't capture that very central and obvious concept.
What would you say to someone who is a non-cognitivist and just thinks that murder is wrong? The statement just really amounts to something like "boo to murder." What would you say to convince them otherwise?
Well, I think that non-cognitivism accords extraordinarily poorly with both our intuitive understanding of what the moral concepts are and how we use language. So remember, non-cognitivism, the non-cognitivists and the error theorists are the people who say that all moral sentences are false. All that they disagree about is how we use language. And so they just think that, and so I think that it inherits the sort of unintuitiveness of error theory, where it says like, when you're in agony, you can't think, this really is bad. Like that's neither true nor false on that account. But it seems very plausible that when you stub your toe, that really is bad. So that's one problem, that it doesn't seem to capture our substantive moral concepts. But then another, I think, equally serious problem is that or well, I don't know if it's equally serious, but another very serious problem is it's just not a correct account of language. So here are a litany of things that we would. So here are various things you can do with moral sentences that you can only do with propositions. So one thing is you can wonder about them. So you can say, I really wonder if murder is wrong. I really wonder if eating meat is wrong. This is not something that you can do with things that are neither true nor false. Because if they're neither true nor false, what are you wondering about? So you can't say, I wonder if shut the door. I wonder if go Yankees. You can't wonder about things that are non-propositional. But it seems like you really can wonder, like, oh, I wonder if murder is wrong. Here's another thing. It seems like you can have hopes about morality. You can't say, I hope shut the door, because shut the door it's not a statement about the world. It's a command. You can't say, I hope go Yankees. But you can say, I really hope eating meat is okay so that I'm not doing something morally wrong. Here's something else. You can construct arguments that have multiple premises that are moral premises. So here's one argument that seems reasonable. If it's wrong to kill, it's wrong for me to kill John. It's wrong to kill, therefore it's wrong for me to kill John. Now, if like saying it's wrong to kill meant like boo killing, then you can't have if statements, because if statements are saying like conditional on this thing being the case, this other thing is the case. But if they're non-propositional, then they're not talking about anything that is the case. And so I think non-cognitivism just has really severe problems with accommodating both our moral concepts and the way that we intuitively use language.
Yeah, I saw a conversation with Ask Yourself and Majesty of Reason recently. They spoke about moral realism for a bit. It wasn't so much a debate, more just a conversation. And I know that Ask Yourself is an anti-realist. I don't know specifically what position he endorses, but
I think he's some type of subjectivist.
Yeah, I think that might have been it. But he said that to him, as far as his experience is concerned, he can't tell it. There's no difference between him thinking that something is wrong or him just really not liking something, which, even though I think he's a subjectivist, that seems to align with a non-cognitivist view of things, that they just think like murder, yuck, or something like this.
Well, I don't know. I think if you're a subjectivist, you can say that, because what you would say is like, when you're saying that the thing is wrong, like, to say murder is wrong is to say I disapprove of murder. You say murder is very wrong. You're saying I really, really disapprove of murder. And so he's saying he doesn't have a different, like, his concept of something being strongly disapproved of by him is the same as his concept of it being very wrong.
Right. It's just when he said that he can't tell the difference between something that he thinks is immoral and something he just really doesn't like. I find that strange, because there are things that I really don't like that I don't think are immoral. And there are things that I think are immoral that don't really elicit much of an emotional response. Like I don't seem to disapprove of that much. So like stealing a penny from someone, I would say is probably immoral, but I don't really care about. And someone eating with their mouth open is something I probably wouldn't say is immoral, but something I really don't like. So it seems that taste and our moral attitudes are on different axes. So I don't really know what he means by that.
Yeah, I think that, like, there seem to be things that, like, you might approve of something, but also, so he often says that, like, when you say something is wrong, you're saying, like, I desire not to do that or something. But that just doesn't seem to capture the concept. So there seem to be lots of people who desire to eat meat and yet nonetheless recognize that eating meat is wrong. Or, I'll give I'm not a perfect utilitarian. Sometimes I spend money frivolously in ways that are, not maximally conducive to utility. I approve of spending the money that way when I do it, even though I don't think that it's what I ought to do. And so, I don't think that it accurately captures our moral concepts.
Yeah, sure. So I think it's probably worthwhile going into some of the arguments that directly argue in favor of realism. I think probably the most popular one that's having its sort of moment in the limelight at the moment is our companions in guilt arguments. Could you explain what companions in guilt arguments are and why they work in favor of realism?
Yeah, so I think that the companions in guilt arguments, I think of them as being mostly sort of defensive arguments. So it's very often the case that moral anti-realists will say, morality can't be objective because it has X, Y, and Z objectionable features. So they'll say, morality can't be objective because morality is talking about things that are not about the physical world. And there are no facts that aren't about the physical world. And then you say, well, here are these things that are very like morality in a lot of ways that there seem to be facts about, including that they're non-physical. And so as a result, like this argument against moral realism doesn't work. So I think my favorite, like the companions in guilt argument that I like the most is probably with modal facts. And I think, that's partially because I'm not that informed about, the mathematical Platonism debate. But people will very often say something like, well, morality can't be objective because, when you say that it's wrong to torture people, you're not making a claim about the physical world, and all real claims are claims about the physical world. That's ironic because the claim, all real claims are claims about the physical world, is not itself a claim about the physical world. But even putting that aside, so what you say is, here's a plausible claim. There cannot be married bachelors. Okay, and when you say that there cannot be married bachelors, it implies things about the physical world, but it is not only a thing about the physical world. And in fact, that statement is true. Now, consider a different statement. The statement, there aren't any married bachelors. Both of those statements say exactly the same things about the physical world. They both say that no matter where you look throughout the entire universe, you will never find a married bachelor. And yet those are very different sentences. The sentence, there can't be married bachelors, and there aren't married bachelors. There are many things that there aren't, but there could be, like probably unicorns. So I think that, so lots of the supposedly objectionable features of morality are going to apply to these modal facts. So they're facts that are not about the physical world. They seem sort of weird. It's kind of hard to sort of see exactly what they're about. They make reference to possible worlds and so on and so forth. So I think that that's a companions in guilt argument that I like, where you say, look, here's this other thing that we agree exists, and this thing, if your arguments worked, then this thing wouldn't exist. Therefore, your arguments don't work. I think the more popular version is the sort of epistemic arguments, so the epistemic arguments are like, they talk about what you have reasons to do. They talk about what you should do in an epistemic sense. So they say, if all the premises if you accept all the premises in an argument, then you have decisive reason to accept the conclusion. Now, that's not a moral claim. That's an epistemic claim. It's saying that if you accept all the premises but don't accept the conclusions, you're being irrational. The same way that in a moral case, we would say if you do something, you're being immoral. And so I think that the epistemic statements, they're very obvious. It's very obvious that there are some things that are well and truly irrational. But the claim that something is irrational to believe, that's not a statement about the physical formation of atoms. That's not a statement about the physical world. Nor is that a statement about, it's not a statement about the physical world. And yet it's very plausible that that statement is true. And so people will say, well, how can these moral facts be normative? How can they say that there are things that you should do? And you say, well, the same way that the epistemic facts should be normative. There are things that you should believe. Namely, you should believe the conclusion if you believe the premises. Now, that's not a moral should, but that's an epistemic should. So the idea is that, so the basic idea of the companions in guilt argument is there are all these arguments that people make against moral realism. But if we actually accepted them, then we would throw out things that we're very confident exist. And you can pair these with the arguments for moral realism. So you can say, well, why do we think that there can't be married bachelors? Well, the reason we think there can't be married bachelors, the reason we think that it's irrational to accept all the premises, but reject a conclusion, is because it seems so obvious that that's the case. And then you say, we don't have a further reason. We have no scientific evidence for this, but it seems incredibly obvious that that's the case. And then you say, well, in a similar sense, it seems very obvious that it's wrong to torture infants for fun. And so error theory is out. And then you say, in a similar sense, it's very obvious that even if everyone approved of, torturing people, it would still be wrong. And when you say it would still be wrong, that's true. It's not neither true nor false. And that's very obvious. And so you get to the very same motivation, the very same considerations that serve as motivations for the other things that we believe in also serve as motivations for morality.
What would you say to someone who sort of bites the bullet on epistemic anti-realism? So moral realist comes out and says, well, if we're going to commit ourselves to moral anti-realism, we have to commit ourselves to some kind of epistemic anti-realism, and there are no categorical reasons for belief either. And the anti-realist just says, yeah, I'm happy with that. And really, epistemic reasons are instrumental. It's something like you have reason to believe evidence given that you value truth, or something like this. It's like it's a hypothetical reason as long as you care about truth. But if you don't care about truth, you have no reason to believe evidence or to accept a conclusion if all the premises are true and an argument's valid.
Yeah, well, so I think that, so, I mean, I, this is one reason why I don't think that the companions and guilt argument, at least in the epistemic case, is super effective, which is, well, I think that it is very obvious that there are epistemic facts. I think that it's only as obvious as moral facts. So if the people are going to deny the moral facts, I think that it's also very plausible that they're going to deny the epistemic facts. But I think the reply here that I would give is just, it's so obvious that there are these epistemic facts. So imagine you're talking with someone, and they say, and you say, okay, do you agree that it's wrong to kill? They say yes. And then you say, do you agree that the death penalty is killing? And they say yes. So then you say, do you agree that the death penalty is wrong? They say no. And you're like, okay, which premise do you reject? And they're like, I accept all the premises and that the conclusion follows from the premises, but I reject the conclusion. It's like, it's so obvious that they're being irrational, that there's some mistake going on. And I think that, like, I actually have had this experience where this exact thing has happened. And it's just like, I mean, when it sort of happens in the moment, it's just so clear that the other person is like being foolish in some way. No, as for the claim about it being like true independent of our attitudes, well, so you might say, so like, I think that it's not going to be irrational. Like maybe there are going to be cases in which you have reason to make yourself the type of agent who holds irrational beliefs. So if there was some pill that would make me hold up irrational beliefs, but it would be better for the world, I don't think it would be irrational to take the pill. But if we really imagine a being who sincerely believes every premise in an argument and that the conclusion follows from the premises, because it does, but they don't believe the conclusion, it seems so clear that they're making a mistake, that they are acting contrary to reason. And so then that means that reason actually gives demands. It actually tells us what we ought to believe. And so then from that, you can get epistemic normativity. And then also, ironically, if you deny epistemic normativity, then no one has any reason to believe your view. And Spencer Case has an article in which he argues from epistemic realism to moral realism. He's pressed this line at length, where he argues that sort of if you don't believe in epistemic realism, then you can't say anyone else should adopt your view because you don't believe anyone else should have it. There's any beliefs for which people should adopt.
Yeah, I also I read I think his name's Thomas Kelly. He wrote a paper on epistemic instrumentalism, and the example he gave against it was let's say that I want to see a movie, but I haven't seen it yet, and my friend has, and my friend tells me the end of the movie, spoils it. I don't want a true belief about the end of the movie, so believing what he's told me is not in line with my goals or desires, yet it still seems that I have a reason to believe what he said because he doesn't have a history of lying to me or something like this.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think, there are a lot of examples like that. So there might be a case where, like, I mean, I don't know. So suppose someone said, well, hearing about the Holocaust makes me sad. And I would desire for the Holocaust to never have happened. So because of that, I believe that the Holocaust didn't happen. That seems flagrantly irrational.
Yeah. I think that's sort of, like you say, it seems that the realists sort of just arguments for realism take the form of just defending against other positions. Like, our choices are this: either it's the case that slavery really is bad, or you commit yourself to all these other positions that seem wildly implausible. And it's sort of like looking at these scales of like, well, slavery does seem like it's quite bad, so it seems quite plausible that that's the case, and all these other positions are false.
There's an article I read by someone called Philosophy Indie, and the title was "Moral Realism is a bit silly, really." And he was making fun of some, I think, tweet that someone had made where they claimed moral realism was silly, and he went towards the the various things that people would have to say about torture. So the non-cognitivist, torture is neither wrong nor right. It's just not even the type of thing that can be called wrong or right. That's not correct. That's just conceptually confused. Error theory: the statement torture is wrong is false. Subjectivism: torture is wrong because I disapprove of it. If I approved of it, it would be right. And moral realism: torture is wrong and would be wrong even if you approved of it. Like, of course, moral realism is the best position of that bunch. It's the only one that doesn't have to say things that are wildly crazy about lots of cases.
What would you say specifically about error theory that fails? Is there any other reasons to reject error theory beyond just, slavery is wrong is false is just a seemingly very strange thing to say?
Yeah, so I think that there are quite a few arguments against error theory, some kind of stronger than others. So I think that, one of the best ones is just that it seems like there are some true things to be said about morality. And it's just, it's crazy how much of a deviation from our common sense error theory is. So, like, if a person says, wow, Hitler was very evil, that seems so obviously true, and yet they have to deny this. They have to deny that, anytime you say that someone was evil or some action was wrong or something was bad, and you say, this tornado that killed a lot of people was terrible, but that's false. It wasn't terrible. And so that's really implausible. I think that maybe perhaps even bigger problem for error theory is what it has to say about what we have reasons to care about for ourselves. So if you think that there are things that we have reasons to care about independently of our desires, then that means there are things that are reasons to care about. And if there are, reasons to care about particular things, then it seems like there's actual value in the world. There are things that really matter. And then, it's very easy to get the falsity of error theory from that, which is why basically all the error theorists deny that there are desire independent reasons. But it's so plausible that there are desire independent reasons. So, that are prudential. So take the following case. A person, they don't care about what happens to them. So they only care about pain that occurs if it doesn't come from their pancreas. So right now they're experiencing intense agony, just unbelievably intense agony. And they don't know if it is being generated by some problem with their pancreas or not. And so the doctor offers them two medications. One would just definitely get rid of the pain, and one of them would only get rid of the pain if it comes from their pancreas. And they say, okay, I'm indifferent between the two of those because my current set of desires are such that I only care about the things that, my suffering to the extent that it comes from my pancreas. That seems obviously irrational. Or Derek Perfect gave a famous case of a man with future Tuesday indifference, where he cares what happens to him in the future, but only if it doesn't happen on a future Tuesday. So you give them a choice. You're like, we're either going to viciously torture you in the most horrendous ways imaginable, on Tuesday, or we're going to give you a pinprick on Monday. And he says, I'll take the pinprick I'll take the horrificness torture on Tuesday. And you might think, okay, but surely this guy can't really hate the torture that much if he's willing to take it. But remember, he only doesn't care about torture on a future Tuesday. So when it is Tuesday, he'll hate the torture. And in fact, we can even stipulate that while he's being tortured on Tuesday, he'll be hypnotized to believe it's Monday. So his subjective experience is exactly the same that it would be if he were being tortured on Monday. But nonetheless, he just has an arbitrary preference for not being tortured on Tuesday. Well, it really seems like he should take the deal where he gets the pinprick on Monday rather than the torture on Tuesday, which shows that we have reasons to care about things independent of our desires, which shows that some things really matter independendly of our desires, which shows moral realism is true. There was another case that was given of a ideally consistent anorexic, where the person they have such a strong desire to be thin that they starve themselves to death. And they're, it seems like with real life anorexics, they're not ideally consistent, but there are cases that are sort of like this. If a person who's mentally ill, if they cut themselves, when they cut themselves, they have a desire to do so. But nonetheless, it seems like really they shouldn't, that's not what they should be doing. They're acting contrary to reason when they cut themselves. And so it just seems like there are all these cases in the prudential domain where error theory is going to have to say really implausible things. Those are some problems. I also think that another problem for error theory is that it has trouble accommodating for the phenomenon of moral progress. So think about the way that morality is sort of converged. We can make compelling arguments in the moral domain that convince people. This is very surprising, and it doesn't occur in any other subjectivist domains. Nobody convinces anyone when they talk about aesthetics that their tastes are bad. Nobody convinces anyone that the flavor of ice cream that they like is actually doesn't taste good. It's not the case that through prolonged reflection, people sort of converge on the right answers on various topics. Well, they do in the moral domain. Well, here's a good explanation for people converging after they carefully reflect. They figure out what the right answers are. And so if that's true, then it's able to explain data. So I think that, there are various other problems for moral realism. If people are interested for error theory, if people are interested for sort of a full account of all the problems I have with that, I wrote an article titled "Moral Realism is True," where you can find if you just type it into Google, "Moral Realism is True," Bentham's Bulldog. So
we briefly touched on it earlier, but I think it might be worth going into a little bit more detail about the prevalence of moral disagreement and what problems it brings to moral realism. So I think, like you said, just the mere fact that people disagree about something really says nothing about it being not objective or stance dependent or something like this. People disagree about climate change. People disagree about the existence of God, but the existence of God is objective. It's not that he's true for some people and he doesn't exist for me or something like this. But I imagine the anti-realist would say that in other domains, there's much less disagreement. So if you look at science, for example, there might be small amounts of disagreement, but it's not the case that China has their own physics or Saudi Arabia has their own biology or something like this. There seems to be more prevalent moral disagreement than there is disagreement in other things that we take for granted that they're objective. How would a realist go about explaining that?
So I think a couple of things are worth saying. One of them is that I think that there are lots of domains in which we see similar amounts of disagreement. So, for example, if you just look at basically any philosophical question, you're going to get relatively similar amounts of disagreement. If you go through the 2020 Phil Paper survey, which polled philosophers on a wide variety of questions, if you have questions where there are like 4 or more options, you get basically roughly as much disagreement as you get in the moral realism case. And in fact, you get about as much disagreement between the different moral theories as you do on the question of whether or not moral realism is true. But there's clearly a fact of the matter about whether moral realism is true. And so I don't think that the disagreement threatens it. Now, maybe the thought is that, well, okay, sure, there's disagreement, but there's a lot of disagreement. But in the case of moral realism, it seems like there's most disagreement as a result of, culture, it differs the most depending on where people live. But I mean, there are just very obvious parallel cases where you have similar amounts of disagreement based on culture and religion and so on and so forth. So here are two examples. One of them is religion. Religion differs way more than morality. You have way more different religions. Whether you have more different religions than moralities, that'll depend on exactly how you define each of them. But there are a lot of different religious views, and they differ dramatically by time and place, and if differed a lot throughout human history. So the first case of something where it differs a lot, depending on where you are in the world, is religion. Another example is just the question of whether or not morality is objective. That differs a lot depending on the time and place you are. So if you go to a random college campus, a lot of people are going to say that morality is objective. It's subjective. Well, if you go to Saudi Arabia, a lot of people are going to think that morality is objective. And then I think a third case, which is maybe the most decisive, is the case of politics. So politics can, in many cases, be reduced to purely factual questions. So take, for example, the minimum wage. Now, there's going to be various ethical questions about the minimum wage. There are going to be ethical questions about the minimum wage. But there are also going to be just straightforward factual questions about the minimum wage. Like, will there be more welfare? Like, will the world be a happier place if we have a $15 minimum wage or not? And so the factual questions that go into political issues have just as much disagreement as the moral questions do. So I think that basically it's true that there's a lot of disagreement about morality and that it differs a lot from time and place. But I think that there's also a lot of similarity, and that there are other parallel cases. And I mean, it turns out that there are a near infinite number of things on which we all agree, but those are the things that we don't talk about. We don't spend very much time all being like, I think it's wrong to, smash babies with sledgehammers. Do you? And we go around in a circle asking whether everyone agrees, because everyone agrees. No, there's no need to
all opinions are equal. Dave thinks it's fine to smash babies. You got to respect it.
Yeah, right. And so I think that actually the things that we disagree on are a relatively narrow band in the range of possible moral issues. And then I also think that if you want sort of the deeper explanation why there's so much disagreement, I think that there are a lot of different explanations that the moral realist can give. So the moral realist can, for example, appeal to the fact that lots of people aren't very smart. And so when they think about morality, they come to wrong conclusions because they rely on confused arguments. Also, lots of people's moral views have a lot to do with their culture and their upbringing. The same way that lots of their other views, and so that explains why there's one reason why there's a divergence. Given that people in various places, they're told what to believe when they're young children, and so if you're told the golden rule when you're a young child, you're much more likely to believe the golden rule. So there's just all sorts of factors that explain why there is disagreement in the moral domain, such that I don't think that it's a very puzzling phenomenon. And I think that moral realism do a perfectly adequate job of explaining the range of disagreement. And in fact, I think that if we actually just if we take into account all of the facts when it comes to moral realism, about how morality differs from time and place and so on and so forth, we actually end up getting it favoring moral realism. So Michael Huemer has a good paper on this called, it's something like, moral progress and evolutionary debunking skeptics or something. And the basic thought is that if we actually just look, there's been this enormous convergence over time, and the convergence has, in a lot of ways, followed morality has converged in the ways that you would expect it to converge if moral realism were true.
I think another explanation I heard is that when people debate ethics, to concede your position and be convinced of someone else's position requires that you admit that you've done something wrong, right? So, for example, I wasn't vegan for 25 years, and then I was convinced of veganism. So me accepting veganism as an ethical position required me saying that for 25 years of my life, I was doing something deeply, deeply wrong. Which is not a nice feeling. I have skin in the game on ethical debates. And the same isn't so much true with science or something like this. It's not the case that if I think quantum mechanics is wrong and then someone convinces me that actually it is accurate, it doesn't require me to say that actually I've been a moral monster for for ages. So people seem to have an incentive to sort of dig their heels in and not be convinced of other people's positions, which might explain some more disagreement between each other. One thing I did want to ask is, I think the sort of like a classic argument, one that I would have used when I was younger, is that, it's not as if we discovered some stone tablet somewhere that tells us what the moral truths are. What's the epistemology here? How exactly do we discover moral knowledge? Why do we have more moral knowledge now than we did 2,000 years ago? What tools do we use to discover moral facts?
So I think that the moral facts are in a lot of ways like, mathematical facts or logical facts, or modal facts, which are facts about what's possible and necessary. And so the methodology is relatively similar. We sort of try to start from very plausible premises, then we deduce conclusions from them, and we'll sort of look at the conclusions that are come to by other people, criticize them. We just sort of reflect on the moral implications, see what seems right and what seems wrong. And so the same factors that have allowed us to make progress in mathematics, for example, are, well, we have, this sort of more rigorous processes which we can use. We've developed these sort of sophisticated logical methods. I think in a similar way, morality is advanced. So if you compare the writings of Aristotle to the writings of Judith Jarvis Thomson, Judith Jarvis Thomson's writings are way more sophisticated. And so I think that it's not a super novel methodology. It's the methodology that we apply basically in any case where we don't have where we're not making conclusions about specific facts about the world. So if we're trying to figure out whether something is possible, we think about it and we think, okay, does that seem like the type of thing that's possible? And if we're thinking about a logical principle, if we're arguing about God, we'll compare various principles. We'll think, does that seem plausible? What about that? And so on and so forth. I think, I don't think that there's any super sophisticated shift in methodology. I don't think that the methodology is substantially different from a case where where we're just thinking about any factual question that we don't have empirical data on. We can't do studies, but what we can do is we can look at various principles. We can evaluate how plausible they are. I think that the methodology that I advocate is basically just the one that we use when evaluating philosophical questions. We just evaluate the arguments on both sides. They're generally non-empirical, and we see how plausible they are.
Yeah, I think would you say that thought experiments are a pretty useful tool in that sphere as well?
Yes.
I think it seems that one way to discover moral knowledge is if someone puts forward some moral position and then you come up with some other position that they would have to accept as true to be consistent with their first position, but this one's absurd, then it seems that we've discovered that their original position is false. I think that a lot of the arguments people put against realism when they sort of just take it at face value seems to rely on there only being natural facts. And if we can't see it, it doesn't exist, or can't see it, it's not real. But yeah, I agree. I think that seems quite implausible. There's all kinds of knowledge that we have, and I don't see why morality is special or unique. I think it's probably a good place to stop. I won't hold you any longer. I really appreciate you coming on to talk to me. Is there anything that you want to plug before you go?
So I have a YouTube channel called Deliberation Under Ideal Conditions, where I talk about philosophy. Then I have two blogs. They're both They can both be found on Substack. One of them is called Bentham's Bulldog. You can find it just by Googling it. And the other one is at controlledopposition.substack.com. It's also linked on the Bentham's Bulldog blog. On Bentham's Bulldog, I primarily talk about philosophy, and on the other one, I don't.
Cool. Right. Well, go check it out, everyone. Thanks very much for coming on, Matthew, and I hope to speak to you again soon.
Thank you.